Special welcome to today's podcast. I am excited to have our regular back. Steve is no stranger to us. He is a man who is passionate about changing lives in the space of mental health and employee well-being. Steve, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really good to see you again. Good to be back on the show. Forgive me drinking my coffee. It's still the morning here when we're recording this in the UK, and I need my caffeine boost this morning to keep going.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm doing water because it's midday here.
Excellent. Good.
Yeah. So, Steve, you're joining us all the way from the UK. How's the UK? How's the weather?
Well, at the moment, I'm looking at quite a cold but a bright day, but we have snow in the forecast for much of the north of England where I am. And I'm driving to speak at a conference, which is a couple of hours drive on Friday morning, which is when the snow is supposed to really hit us quite hard. So, we're just bracing ourselves for a snowfall this week.
Oh, wishing you all the best with your through the snow. I have no experience with snow.
No, I was going to say that'll be a unique experience if it happened where you're located, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Steve, let's get straight into our conversation. The conversation of mental health and employee well-being is starting to receive more attention. In fact, the World Health Organization takes out staggering figures. Their statistics says that it's estimated that depression and anxiety cost the global economy $1 trillion per year in lost productivity. That's a huge figure. Let's just start this conversation by probably defining what mental health is and what employee well-being is.
Yeah, I mean, again, I have to position myself as not an expert in this area at all. There are many people better qualified than me. As your listeners, if they've heard my previous story, of course, I'm coming to this as someone who lost my son to suicide. And in the last 3 years since that's happened, I've spent a lot of time in the world of mental health and suicide prevention and workplaces, because my background is in consultancy and leadership and management training has been a particular area of interest for me. Mental health, I mean, we all have mental health. I think everyone would agree with that. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. But of course, when it's not good, it can manifest itself in all kinds of different ways. And two of the most common forms of mental health problems that we've become familiar with are anxiety and depression. And when someone experiences anxiety and depression, that can affect them in all kinds of ways. But it certainly has an impact on how they're able to perceive the world, how they're able to cope with the world on a day-to-day basis. And of course, that will include how they perform at work as well.
Awesome. So why then is it important for employers to consider the employee mental health and the employee well-being in a workplace?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, firstly, there is probably not a business out there that doesn't want to be successful. All businesses want to perform, and they can put their infrastructures, their factories, their buildings, their processes in place to help ensure their business becomes successful. But if their people are not performing at the levels that are required, then they're not going to achieve success. Now, their people are only able to perform if they're able to thrive, if they're in an environment that we would call a psychologically safe environment. So let me just qualify that statement. A lot of companies are very familiar with having a physical safe workplace. Health and safety manuals, and health and safety people will audit these manuals, are there to make sure that when people come to work, they are physically safe, particularly in, say, construction jobs or manufacturing jobs, but in all workplaces. What employers need to be aware of is there is a need for a psychologically safe work environment where people feel they can come to work and they're able to thrive mentally. Their own well-being is being taken care of, and they believe that their employer has that interest at heart as well. Now, one of the reasons as well why this is really important, and I saw a statistic just quoted this week, is that a manager within a business will be responsible for spending time with an employee to a level of around about 70% of that employee's life, if you like, whilst they're at work. So I want that to be made really clear, that a manager will spend more time looking after or working with that employee than that employee spends with their partner or with their family or with their friends or anywhere else. So a huge amount of an employee's time is spent at work. And that's why it's really important that a company culture is set up to look after the well-being of that employee.
You actually raise a very important aspect that people actually don't sort of think about. The fact that most people actually spend most of their lifetime at work compared to their families, So then what would be the consequences that may arise as a result of a company ignoring implementation of any program that help with employee well-being or employee mental health?
Yeah, I mean, the consequences initially are going to be underperformance, high costs of absenteeism and sickness, things like presenteeism, where employees are actually turning up for work physically, but mentally and psychologically, they're not able to do their very best job. And we know the cost of presenteeism, you quoted some staggering statistics there, the £1 trillion figure. We know it's over 1.27 billion pounds or more in the UK, the cost of mental health to businesses here. That's just what's recorded in terms of, to some degree, absenteeism. But if you look at presenteeism, then the cost of that to a business is likely to be 3 times higher than the cost of absenteeism. Now, absenteeism is the one thing that most HR managers and directors will measure. But how do you measure presenteeism when someone's at work, but their head isn't really at work because they're suffering with anxiety or depression? And this is why it's so important to create a culture where people, you imagine coming to work and that you dread coming to work. You've already got some pressures outside of work, maybe family issues, maybe debt, financial worries, all sorts of things going on. And then you come to a work environment where it's really high pressure, where all the focus is about how you perform. And if you don't perform and deliver on your job, then you're going to be brought in, and a conversation's going to be had, and you're living under that kind of threat. You're not going to have an employee that performs to their best if they're constantly anxious and worried about, whether they're going to be able to do the job or not. So I think we have to look at the whole culture of a business and look at it from an employee well-being perspective first, and a performance issue. The performance will follow as long as the right processes and procedures are in place as well.
Absolutely. So I'm glad that you bring the idea of culture into the conversation. Culture does play a big role in the way the employees deal with mental health in the workplace. So then how can businesses create a culture that supports employee well-being?
Yeah, another great question. It starts at the top, Sarah. Look, it's no good you having mental health champions who are typically employees on the front line. It's no good having one HR director who believes passionately in well-being if the CEO of the company and the board of directors don't buy into the importance of well-being. The culture's not going to change. So it starts at the very top. You have to have a board of directors that believes that employee well-being is a business imperative, and then make sure they facilitate and allow for that to happen through the various channels throughout the organization. It is, I was going to say it's as simple as that. It's not simple, but it's important. That's where it starts.
So, the phrase everything rises and falls with a leader is so true, even in this conversation. So then, would we be stretching it too much if we are saying employee well-being and mental health must be part of the strategic agenda that a company is pursuing as they pursue their business interest?
Yeah, look, that's such an important point you make, Sarah, that it should be when a board meeting takes place, number one on the agenda should be employee well-being. How are we doing? How are our employees? What is their well-being like? When we have our meetings, team meetings, I think every meeting should start off with let's just go around the room and just on a scale of 1 to 10, just tell me how you're doing. 10 is you're on top of your game, you're feeling great. 1 is you really need to have a conversation with me afterwards. Where are we? Let's just see how people are doing. So I think it's really important that employee well-being features in every meeting that takes place throughout the business.
So I love the practical aspects that you're bringing, and that doesn't take long, right? If we're sitting around the table, just to check in how each person is doing, like you said, on the scale of 1 to 10, how you're doing. And if you notice that somebody is struggling, just creating that space where they can engage further and see if you can give them support.
Yeah, look, I think just to add to this as well, Sarah, there'll be managers listening to your show today and to this broadcast that will sit there in a meeting room with their team, and they'll be telling them about, here's what we've got to achieve today, here's what the goals are for this week, and tell me what your performance figures are, what are you doing? And they'll be looking at their employees, and they'll be seeing 1 or 2 of them that are just not responding in the right way or not. But, they're so busy. They probably don't want to ask that question. They'll probably think that's a little odd. He's not smiling or she's not smiling. They're not responding. Look, I'm busy. We need to get this. I need to find out what's going on and what's happening with performance. By opening up that question right at the beginning and asking, look, how are we doing? But creating that environment. Look, the first time you ask that question, you're not going to get honest answers. You've got to provide the right safe environment where people feel that you're genuinely asking that question and you're genuinely interested in the answer as well.
So this actually requires a mind shift from the managers and the leaders' point of view, because in most cases, the workplace has never been quite human. Let's put it that way. It's all about, the output. Are we meeting our targets and so on? That humanness is not there. So it will require then the managers to start thinking and showing up quite differently, where they're bringing this humanness in the workplace.
Yeah, I had a meeting yesterday with one of the heads of one of the UK charities, mental health and suicide prevention charities. And we were talking over a coffee, and this particular charity focuses a lot on schools. So it's similar to a workplace. It's just got younger people, really. And he talked about the fact that we're constantly trying to measure schools on performance and targets, and this cascades then down to the children. Well, in the same way that targets and performance cascade down to employees, he was saying that what about if we measured kind of how children feel they're being cared for and loved and nurtured? And what about if we measure that as well, as an important measure? You could argue the same thing in a workforce. How well loved, how well nurtured, do employees feel? Do we ever measure that? And there'll be one or two people listening to this go, oh, so we've got to measure kindness now. Why not?
Mm, mm, mm. And I'm glad that you bring that kindness aspect. And now kindness is being embraced as part of leadership trait. Uh, when we had our conversation the last time, we did dive into talking about if a manager is going to deliver, a message to an employee who's probably being fired or being released, what do you do? How do you deliver that message, with kindness and compassion?
Yeah, look, there are many difficult conversations that a manager is going to have in his or her career. And these could be, as you say, they've got to let somebody go from the job. It could be redundancy. It could be that they've been fired for poor performance. It could be they've got to have a conversation with them about performance generally and tell them they're not performing well. It could be a disciplinary issue of some kind of complaint raised. So there will be many different forms of difficult conversations managers might have to have. And I think they need to get better at this. They need to learn the skills of empathy and understanding and listening. And in doing so, quite often what will happen is that by understanding, you'll maybe able to come up with a better solution than the one you originally thought you were needing to implement. Do we listen enough, really, or do we see a situation of poor performance, for example, and go, right, we're going to bring this person in, we're going to give them a warning because their performance is not bad, and we're just going to tell them? Or are we going to sit there and say, look, Sarah, I need to have a conversation with you this morning. Your numbers are not where they should be. I'm pretty certain you know that. I know that. It's been this way for a while. I kind of want to understand what's going on for you. Tell me a little bit about why this is happening from your perspective. Let's just seek to understand. Stephen Covey, the famous author of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of his early habits was seek first to understand. And I think if we learn to do that a little bit better as a manager, we might start to understand our employees a little bit better. We might be able to then manage and support them much more effectively.
Beautiful. I love just the way you've practically brought that into the conversation of how a manager's demeanor might actually be so useful when you're having those difficult conversations. Do you just want to touch a little about also putting a safety net? When you these difficult conversations, I know that in our previous conversations, we talked about an employee who was handed, a letter of, being released from work, and on his way home, he committed suicide. Is there something different that the manager could have done to avoid that catastrophe?
Yes, I think it's not to underestimate the impact that bad news can have on an employee. In the particular case you referred to, you're absolutely right. There was a complaint made against that employee, and that employee was suspended and was devastated by that news and went home and tragically took his own life. So I think one of the things that we can do, firstly, it comes back to empathy and understanding from the manager who's having that conversation, first of all. But then the processes within the business need to kick in as well, and the policies. So in this case, what is the company's safeguarding policy when an employee has been delivered that kind of news? Now, the company in question that we were just talking about has changed their policies and procedures. When such a conversation happens, when that kind of news is delivered, there's immediately a backup process where the HR team or occupational health or a member from the mental health support team will be brought in, and a meeting will be arranged for that employee immediately to sit down and talk with them about, okay, you've been given this news. It's not great news. Just tell me what your plan is now. How can we support you? What can we do? So we need to have those kind of policies and procedures in place to safeguard an employee in that situation.
So then it actually calls for people to relook at the policies that are in place, because a lot of people don't actually think about this. They'll have other, output related policies, but nothing on the softer side that deals with mental health.
No, you're right. And just think for a moment, if you're in a factory and an employee injures themselves on a piece of machinery, you'll have a policy for that, won't you? You'll have a follow-up. What are the steps that happen? You'll absolutely have that. So why don't we have these for mental health and well-being?
Good question. Good question. So then, let's say a manager identifies an employee mental. What should they do?
Sarah, I'm going to ask you to ask that question again. The line broke up quite a bit there, and I missed the question.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me now, Steve?
Yeah, got you good.
Okay, sure. So I was asking about a manager who identifies that they've got a team member who is struggling with mental health. What can such a manager do?
Well, first of all, as I say, they can listen. They can ask some questions to try and understand what the situation is. A really useful framework that I use quite often is a very simple acronym to remember, and it's TED, and that is TED, and that is, okay, Sarah, tell me what's going on for you at the moment. Explain to me so I can understand, and describe to me how this is impacting on you. So we can use that very simple framework to ask some really positive questions. Now, the next step is, okay, I'm the manager. I've asked those questions. I now understand the reasons why, or some of them, why that employee is struggling. What I now need to do is to be able to provide support. But I'm not a skilled mental health professional. I don't know how to do that, and nor should it be really my responsibility to do that. So from this point of view, that manager needs to know what support and resources are available. What are the next steps? Does the company have an insurance policy and an employee assistance program, which are very popular in the UK? Particularly not so much in other countries, but in some. Is there a program? Are the counsellors available? Are the helplines available? What is the process within the company? So again, if the board of directors and the company don't have the support mechanisms in place, that manager's in a really difficult situation because, okay, I understand now, but I don't know what to do. So that manager needs supporting with the right infrastructure and to know how to signpost that employee to whatever support is available.
The next question would be, are there signs that a manager can look out for? I know we could have touched this a little bit as we were conversing, but are there outright signs that as a manager, you can actually be able to point to see that an employee is struggling with mental health?
Yeah, I think there are a number of individual ones which I'll mention in a moment. But I think the first thing is, am I noticing any obvious changes in the behaviors of this person, from their mannerisms, their demeanor? Is there just something, I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's definitely a change. And in my view, it's not a positive change. So just look for any kind of changes in behaviors and attitudes. On a more practical level and specific level, there could be that the employee's timekeeping has become poor. They're not turning up to work when they should be. There's maybe been more absenteeism than we would have expected from that employee before. We're seeing their work performance is dipping. That's not as good as it has been in the past. We're maybe looking at team meetings where once upon a time they would have interacted much more often, and they're not doing. And in fact, if it's an online meeting, maybe what we're starting to see is they're not turning the camera on where they did once before. So, we're starting just to see one or two actions and activities that are making us think this is different. This is not what I've come to expect from this person before. Now, it could be that there's some really obvious signs, such as the person just sitting at the desk, not working, staring at the screen. They could be tearful. They could appear anxious. They're speaking far more quickly, or they're in a meeting, or they're much slower in their speech and more hesitant. There's again, you will intuitively sense some of these things, but those are some of maybe the more practical things, if you like, that you would, or specific things that you maybe be looking out for.
So I'm also sensing, with this new mindset of being able to help people with mental health, there's a need to be quite a present leader. You've got to be present. So you're checking what's happening with your employees in a positive manner, where you're connecting with them, probably at a personal level as well.
Yeah, I think both is really important. You used the term human earlier on. We've got to become more human in business, and don't treat employees as commodities. We need to treat them as human beings, depending on your viewpoint, with hearts and souls. And that is really important to consider. These are skills that are typically not taught to managers. For many years, I was a director of a leadership and management training company, and I look back at the training courses that I provided to companies, and there was not one element of that course that looked at employee well-being. Now, this is 10, 12, 13 years ago, but there's nothing. There's nothing included in what we delivered that included employee well-being. It was really all about performance and coaching and delegation skills and communication skills, all those kind of things. I think one other important point I'd like to mention as well, Sarah, is that we've talked a lot about managers, and we're talking typically about line managers here being more human and being able to interact in a better way with their employees. But who's supporting the line manager as well? That is really important. Where does that individual go for their support? And I think, again, companies need to look at that because there's huge amounts of pressures put on line managers to perform, of course, and the responsibility they have. If you think about the responsibility in the bigger picture as well, just imagine for a moment that you've got, let's say, 100 employees. So as a company, you're thinking, all right, Steve, you're saying that we've got to look after the well-being of 100 employees. Therefore, I'm responsible for the well-being of 100 employees. No, you're not. You're responsible for 100 employees plus their families and close friends and anyone associated with them. Because if that employee suffers acute mental health problems, or even more tragically takes their own life as a result of workplace stress and pressures, then you will have impacted, and the ripple effect will impact the family, the friends, and everyone else. So arguably, a company boss has the responsibility for several hundred people, not just the 100 employees that he or she looks after.
And that's quite a shift in the thinking, because
that's quite a sobering thought, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that you once had some conversation with, people that actually come to even a place of an incident when somebody has taken their life. All those people get impacted. So there's almost like a ripple effect, other than the individual that is involved.
Yeah, we know that, and this is a global figure from Office of National Statistics that will tell us that for every suicide, the ripple effect will, on average, impact directly or indirectly on another 135 people. We lose in the UK around 6,000 plus people each year to suicide. Now, if you multiply that by the 135, I was never good at math at school, so you might need to help me with this, but I think that's somewhere in the region of 800,000 people every year who are impacted in some way by suicide, an individual suicide. That's a colossal, number of people. So yes, this ripple effect is enormous.
Yeah, yeah, quite sobering and very concerning. So let's turn the conversation around. The employee is struggling with mental health. How do they open up? There's also the fear of being stigmatized. And that's the big thing that a lot of report. They say, if I open up and tell my manager or my colleagues that I'm struggling with mental health, they're going to stigmatize me.
Yeah, look, we know that stigma plays a huge part generally in society in whether people choose to open up and talk about their mental illness. And ordinarily it will be, will others judge me? What will they think about me generally? How will this affect me in a practical way? So in the workplace, for example, as you rightly say, if I open up and say I have a mental health problem, will that go on my record? Particularly if I go to a doctor, for example. Now it's on my record. How will that affect future employment? Potentially. So there are all kinds of reasons why people would not want to open up. So firstly, it comes back to the culture of the organization. Is that culture creating a safe space where I, as an employee, would have no hesitation if I was struggling with my mental health or had been to see the doctor and received a diagnosis, would I have no hesitation in telling my line manager, knowing that I would be supported? Or am I going to be concerned that this will go on my record in some way, or I will be treated differently? If that's the case, I'm not going to say anything. I'll just keep quiet. So firstly, it's back to culture and creating that psychologically safe space. Sometimes when we talk about psychologically safe workplaces and spaces, people think it's a room that you create somewhere that people can go into. And there are such places, definitely. But a psychologically safe space is the business, it's the culture. So that's the first thing that needs to be in place. Then you need the person having the conversation. Go back to what I said before. They need to show empathy and kindness and consideration and understanding. Then they need to ask the questions using the TED framework. Tell me what's going on for you. Explain to me what's happening. Describe to me how this is impacting on you. And once they've done that, they need to be managers need to be trained to know what to do next. Here's one important thing as well. When they're having that conversation, if they are concerned enough about that individual that they are showing very high levels of anxiety or depression, and that manager thinks there might be a risk of that person self-harming or ending their own life, then that manager has to be prepared to ask a really difficult question. And that question is, can I ask you, are you considering ending your own life? Or is suicide a consideration for you at the moment? I want you to imagine that question. I want you to imagine asking that question, which is a question I've had to ask several times in the last couple of years. It's not an easy question to ask, but it is so important that we are direct about these issues. Now, there are many myths surrounding suicide and the language and conversations. And one of those myths is, well, surely, Steve, if you mention the suicide word to someone, are you not planting that thought in their head? And we can tell you categorically, all the research is out there, that it is a myth. That if you ask someone, are you thinking of ending your own life, or is suicide an option for you? You are more likely to get that person to open up. They are more likely to feel a sense of relief that you've asked it, and they're more likely to open up and let you know where their thoughts are. It is unlikely that you will plant that seed in their head. It's most likely that it is already there. If it is, you're just now getting it out into the open. It's a really important question we've got to be asking more when we are really, really worried about people. And when they say, yep, Steve, it is, thank them, because that was a big thing for them to do, and say, okay, what do we need to do next? How can I help you? You know, how do we keep you safe? And what's really important for companies to have in place is a safety plan that a manager can implement. And a safety plan is really exactly what it sounds like. And that is, how do we keep that person safe during the next few minutes or next few hours until professional help can arrive? And on the Jordan Legacy website, we have lots of help and resources, including links to organizations that show how to create a safety plan. You know, we've you know, the information is out there and it is available.
So as we wrap this conversation that has been so helpful, so insightful, and just a lot of practical ideas that you bring to the table, what would be the challenge that you'd give to companies when it comes to them being proactive to prevent mental health and suicide cases?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is recognize that there is a business case for you looking after your employees. Okay, this is not just about you morally doing the right thing. There are actual business benefits. The studies done here in the UK by one of our large financial organizations, Deloitte, of course, which is a global accountancy firm. The studies that they have done repeatedly over the last few years have shown that in the UK, for every £1 invested by a company in employee well-being, you will get between a £5 to £6 return in profitability to the company. So the business case is there. So I think, first of all, recognize there's a business case for doing this. And I think that is really important. The next thing is make that commitment at board level that you are going to look at the culture of the organization and ensure it is one where employees feel that it's psychologically safe to come to work. Not just what the board thinks is psychological safety. It's where employees are telling you, yeah, I feel psychologically safer when I come to work now. So make that commitment. Provide the training is the third tip, really, for your managers there as well. Really, really important that managers are equipped and feel safe themselves to be able to have these types of conversations. And the final point is, you don't need to put the pressure on all the managers to come up with how to implement a well-being strategy within your organization. All the ideas for your well-being strategy are in the heads and minds right now of your employees. If you're prepared to engage with them directly and ask them, what do you think we should be doing? They will tell you. Listen to those employees, take on board those ideas that you think in a practical way can be introduced that will make a difference because employees are telling you they will. And if you can't implement, be really open and upfront with the employees and tell them why. And I think if you can do those 4 things, then you're well on the way to putting in place a psychologically safe environment for people to come to work and thrive and the business to perform.
Wow. Thank you so much, Steve.